Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm filming another recent reads video for you all. As you know, I don't like doing monthly wrap-ups. They take too much time and I read too many books within 1 month to talk about all of them in one video. So when I've read 5 to 7 books, that's when I will get in front of the camera and talk to you guys about everything that I've read thus far. For today's video, I have 7 books to talk about. I have a mixture of ARCs, ebooks, audiobooks, and physical books. The first book I'd like to talk about is Frozen Tides by Morgan Rhodes. This is the 4th book in the Fallen Kingdom series. This is a YA fantasy series. I've talked about it a few times on my channel because it is incredibly addicting. The series is very tropey, but if you're looking for something fun and with a lot of political intrigue, I recommend this. I don't like comparing one author's work to another author's work because they're each like independent projects and they put a lot of work into it, but if I had to compare this to anything, it would be like Game of Thrones but for a younger audience. That doesn't mean that this author Morgan Rhodes isn't taking any risks. Each book that I've read so far has had a very important character death, for example, and Morgan Rhodes does know how to create angst. It's really hard to explain like the summary of the series because it's very much plot driven and it changes from book to book, but I would say that the first book starts off on this continent that is separated into about 3 kingdoms: a northern kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom is led by a very like bloodthirsty type of autocratic ruler type, and he wants nothing more than to conquer the southern kingdom. And in order to conquer the southern kingdom, he goes and manipulates essentially like the chieftain of the middle kingdom, and from there the king of the northern kingdom and like the chieftain of the middle kingdom join forces to march on to the southern kingdom. There's some elemental magic in here, and there's also some romance in here between like multiple people, and this is like a large cast of characters. It does that thing where each chapter is from the point of view of a different person, so you will probably find at least one character to really feel connected to. Yeah, it's really addicting and it's super fun, and I can see why this series was really like hyped up a few years ago. This particular book did feel like it was a bit of a build up to the next installment. That has happened in the series. That doesn't mean that there wasn't any good content here. I could imagine why someone might read this book and might say this was boring because nothing happened. I think stuff happened. I think important things happened, but my idea of action or plot development might be different from someone else's, and that's fine. But I still really enjoyed this. It's really hard for me to give like any of the books in the series like less than 4 stars, so I'm a little biased, but I will obviously keep reading this. The next book I read was actually a reread, and it is The Star Touch Queen by Roshani Chokshi. I was really happy to finally get to a reread. Obviously, the reason why I keep so many books, I have probably over like 400 books at this point, is because I'd at some point love them so much I'd like to reread them and have a new experience with them. And the reason why this book was so important for me to reread is because this is probably one of the few books with that kind of pretty whimsy, very decorative writing that I really connected to. I typically don't like that type of writing. It's very distracting for me, and I get really frustrated when the author isn't like getting to the point. But this book definitely has that type of writing, and I still really loved it. So I think that's definitely a sign of a very talented author, that she can get different types of readers to like her work. I do think that this book was really well liked at some point on BookTube. It was probably before like I started like actively watching other YouTubers. This book is basically a Hades and Persephone retelling with Hindu and Indian influences. So our main character, Maya, is essentially a princess. Her father is the Raja of a like desert type kingdom, and her entire life she's been told that she's cursed because in her kingdom they value what the horoscopes tell them, especially the horoscope of the day of your birth. So the day of her birth, her horoscope tells her that she will have a marriage of death and destruction. Obviously horoscopes are up to interpretation, and so that is where we get the Hades and Persephone retelling. So I don't think this book has a very like in-depth, very like long-winded plot, but what it does lack in that, it makes up for again in the writing, which I mentioned before, and also the characters. I think the story is just fantastic and I really enjoy it. So I definitely noticed more things in this reread that I hadn't before, and I'm probably going to pick up like the follow-up novel that kind of follows a different character that was mentioned here. called, I think it's called The Crown of Wishes. So I'm really looking forward to that. Hopefully I love it just as much, or hopefully even more than The Star Judge Queen. So I think the only thing that would constitute as a flaw in this book is that our main character is a little bit naive, but that is something that I would expect for a girl that's been sheltered her entire life, as well as not having any like friends or family within the palace to really talk to because she's been like shunned. The main character might be a little frustrating for some people, but I don't need to like absolutely love a character 100% to still like the book, if that makes sense. Obviously this was something that I really enjoyed and I gave it like 5 out of 5 stars. So the next book I actually borrowed from my local library, and it was A Cuddle Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. So A Cuddle Witch is a middle grade fantasy series set in Nigeria. Our main character Sunny, I believe, was born in Nigeria, was raised in the States, and then moved back to Nigeria. Sunny feels like an outsider, not only because she has more of like an African American upbringing, which is also touched upon on this book like at greater lengths, but also because Sunny is albino. She has paler skin. Her afro is like, I think in the book it's described as almost yellow, and she has lighter colored eyes, so she physically doesn't also fit in with like her classmates. And then one day Sunny finds out that she has magical abilities. The book does mention how, at least in West Africa, I'm not sure about like the entirety of Africa, but like at least West Africa refers to magic as juju, and other cultures might refer to it as something else. I do want to like mention a really important thing is that a lot of people call this like a Nigerian Harry Potter, which is incredibly offensive. I know I compared Frozen Tides to like Game of Thrones, but that is a Western inspired fantasy compared to another Western inspired fantasy. And for this work, A Cuddle Witch should be compared to not only J.K. Rowling's work, who J.K. Rowling is objectively like a terrible person right now, and it's not fair for Nnedi Okorafor and for the book itself to be compared to Harry Potter just because there are similar tropes, like a small child figures out that they have like magical abilities, if that makes sense. So yeah, and Nnedi Okorafor has spoken about how she doesn't like that comparison. So probably the best part of this book was the magic system and the world that Nnedi Okorafor created. As someone who does read a lot of fantasy, it's not something I've ever read before. My favorite part of the magic system that this world has is that people are rewarded for learning things. So if you finish a book, or if you try a new like ritual that you've never done before, you get these kind of like metal rods that count as currency. So the more you learn, the wealthier you are, and I thought that was really cool. I also think that Sunny, our main character, is really sweet, and I think a lot of people can relate to her. I know I mentioned before I don't need to relate to a character to like love the book, but I do think Sunny is very relatable. Something that Nnedi Okorafor also put in is how outside influences, like how humans, their greed affects the magic users or the juju users in this world. And I thought that was a really interesting concept, because sometimes in fantasy books you have a huge distinction between the magical community and like humans, and they don't really interact and they're incredibly separated. But I do like to see this kind of clash of cultures and how it affects certain people within the magical community. I actually wrote down in my notes how I felt sad that I personally don't know much about like Nigerian culture and mythology and folklore to be able to pick up on the nuances that Nnedi Okorafor put in. I feel like if you do know something about the culture that is being explored in a fantasy book, that's such a like cathartic feeling. So yeah, I think this book is fantastic. I love middle grade, and it deserves like all the hype it's gotten so far. So using my Kindle Unlimited subscription, I also read Faehunter by Sarah K.L. Wilson. So this fae story definitely utilizes the kind of trickster stereotype that fae sometimes have in fantasy, and I know a lot of people like this kind of mischievous type fae character, so it does have that going for it. I did have some problems with the book overall. So this book definitely has one of my least favorite tropes, and that is when you have a character who can't or won't acknowledge the terrible wrong things that a sibling or a family member has done. I really dislike this trope because it doesn't allow for like character growth, but it's also just really frustrating to read when you have a like terrible person doing terrible things and their sibling or their parent or whatever is just like, no, but they're family and I still love them. And it was only until the end where our character was like, okay, maybe my family member is kind of messed up. So the series is about a young woman, and her and her sister go to this like fae ring, and they're told as they like dance around it, a fae will come through. They obviously don't believe this. They think it's just like old wives' tales. Lo and behold, when they do their little dance, a fae does come through. However, the rule is if one comes through, another has to go in. So our main character loses her sister through the fae like portal or whatever, and that causes a lot of problems within the town. Our main character is shunned by like the community. Another thing that kind of frustrated me is that this character is supposed to be this kind of like strong type of female character where she's like physically capable, but she's also kind of like tough, you know. But throughout the book, she's constantly being basically like emotionally like by like so many people within her family, her group of friends, or the community, and she like does nothing about it. She kind of just like walks away from any confrontation, and that's kind of not what I expected from the character that is being like built up. And it was just frustrating to read. No one's just like seeing someone get absolutely like dog walked for like an entire book. So that was something that I also really didn't like. And there's so many characters that like should have gone like some like just desserts, you know what I mean? Like so many people in her community were like just really rude and cruel to her, and I was just getting really frustrated. Can't she just like, I was thinking, why hasn't she just like punched at least one person? Something happened, please, because these people are terrible. But yeah, nothing really happened until like the last few chapters. I think some people might like a certain like fae human relationship that is being like built up in this first book, but yeah, other than that, I don't know what else was like great about this book. I was interested but not like amazed at the ending, because it like hinted at where the next book was going, which I'm mildly interested to see what happens next. But there are other like Kindle Unlimited series that I really should get back to instead of this one. I treated this one more like a filler type novel between my like heavier, denser reads, but this is definitely not one of like the forefront like filler novel series that I want to get through, because there are so many that I've started before on Kindle Unlimited that I would rather get to instead, if that makes sense. So yeah, this book was like a little less than average for me, but at least the cover's nice. So I also read All the Stars and Teeth by Adeline Grace. I got this on ebook from one of my local libraries, and I thought it was fine. It was fun and really fast paced, and there was always, you know, something going on. There was always some sort of point A to point B to point C. Like there was very little kind of like downtime, and when there was downtime, there was like more explanation and exploration of our characters and their backstories. So this fantasy world is composed of different islands, and each island has a different magic type that those people on that island adhere to. If you don't want to study this type of magic, then you would have to like leave that island and go to your like the proper island that you're supposed to be on. So you have different types of magic, like elemental magic, time magic, healing magic, and every person is only allowed to practice one type of magic. So our main character, Amora, is the princess of the kingdom, and she has trained her entire life to be high, I think it's called animancer, and that is basically the like master of souls. The royal family are the only people allowed to practice soul magic, and that has been something like a tradition since like the first king of her like family line. However, on the day of her birthday, when she's supposed to prove to her kingdom that she is worthy of the title of High Animancer, and then she will eventually take over her father's position as like king of the kingdom, something goes wrong, and she is essentially shunned, and people don't trust her anymore. And after she's been shunned, and after she is basically been imprisoned because of what she did during her like ceremony, an opportunity presents itself to her where she could go off and prove that she has the kingdom's best interest at heart. And so she goes off with this like pirate type character. There's some romance, and we have a lot of character growth from our main character, because she's been essentially locked up in her kingdom her entire life. She's never been outside of like her like the island that she grew up on. So through this journey, she's able to go to different islands and experience the cultures of different people, how magic works on different, you know, their respective islands, and it's really fun to read. There's like sea monsters and stuff. One of our main characters is a mermaid siren. I think this book kind of like mixes them together. There's also like a found family type trope going on here. One of my favorite tropes in literature like overall is in this book, where a character acknowledges or is realizing that someone that they love and care about a lot is not the person that they thought they were, that they were kind of not the best person. And it's kind of like the opposite of like Faehunter. We have that here. I like this trope because it creates character growth and it creates like more internal conflict. I will say though that this does feel similar in other types of plots that you see in like YA fantasies, where a girl has to go on some sort of adventure to like prove herself. That being said, it was still fun, you know, there's nothing wrong with this. I also feel that by the time the second book comes out, I might not remember everything that happened. That's just like a feeling. I obviously finished this only like a week or so before. I am worried that this book isn't really the type of book to really like stick with people, because it's so similar to other stuff that's been like published in this genre before. Mind you, I do read a lot, but I also don't think that this book stands out to the average fantasy reader. However, if you don't really read fantasy, this might be something completely new and different and fun for you. I'm also a little biased because I do absolutely love like nautical, pirate, seafaring type fantasies, and I more than likely will give them like a good rating or like a thumbs up, just because that's like something that I gravitate to. It's something that I just love in general. So after I listened to that on audio, I picked up another audiobook called First Test by Tamora Pierce. This is the first book in one of her series within the greater Tortal universe. I wouldn't recommend starting here if you've never read Tamora Pierce, because this does spoil Song of the Lioness Quartet as well as the Immortals Quartet. Spoils a lot. So this book follows a young girl named Keledri, and Keledri would absolutely love to become a Knight of the Realm, and obviously to do that she has to go through training. Luckily, because of what happened in the Song of the Lioness Quartet, girls are allowed to train to become knights. That doesn't mean that the journey for her to get there is going to be any easier. So the training master that Keledri reports to isn't like the most liberal person. He's kind of set in his ways. He doesn't believe that most women have the capabilities to become a knight, despite the fact that Alana from the Song of the Lioness Quartet is an incredibly accomplished knight despite being a woman. So Keledri does kind of face some setbacks from her peers. Some of her like fellow pages are kind of rude and straight up like sexist, and of course her training master does treat her kind of unfairly and is a little more strict on her. So that's pretty much like all I can say about this first book. It's a short book. It reads like a middle grade. So my experience reading Tamora Pierce is typically her writing ages up with the main character's age. So for example, the Song of the Lioness Quartet started off with like a more middle grade approach because our main character was like 11-12, as is in this book. As our main character grew up, Tamora Pierce started exploring more topics, and the topics that Tamora Pierce was talking about was a little more mature. I don't usually see authors kind of branching out in terms of like age range within like a book series. They typically stay within like the same age group. She typically does age up her character pretty quickly throughout the series. For example, in the Song of the Lioness Quartet, Alana was, I think, 11 or 12. And by the end of the series, 4 books later, she's, I want to say, at least 18. And she's doing things that, 18-year-old women might do. So I'm assuming that's what's going to happen here. The audiobook, I think, was like barely 7 hours. So it does go by fast, especially since I listen to audiobooks at like 1.5 to sometimes even 2 speed. So there wasn't any like overt romance here, which I really enjoyed. One, because our character is like 11 or 12, but also because I typically dislike her romances or her approach to romances the most in her series. Not that they're ever bad, but Tamora Pierce's romance don't read like normal like YA middle grade romance. It's definitely like in its league of its own. It's like it's really hard to explain unless you've read it. Yeah, I don't usually like Tamora Pierce's romance, so I appreciated that there was, I would say, little to no romance in general here. But yeah, I just thought I'd throw that out there because I think other people might have had problems with her romance. Despite that, Tamora Pierce is probably one of my favorite fantasy writers, so it's really hard for me to give her like anything less than a 5-star rating. So I gave her a 5-star rating. So I actually held off filming this because I wanted to finish this arc that I got from the publishers through NetGalley, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I believe the publisher is Del Rey. So thank you so much to NetGalley and the publishers for letting me read this early in advance. So I finished reading this on the day of its release, which I was really happy about because it was fantastic, and it deserves all the hype that it will. I'm hoping it'll get a lot of hype. It was just released, so I'm hoping it's going to get a lot of hype, and I've seen people talk about it quite a bit already. But this is I would say, horror book set in Mexico. Our main character's name is Noemi, which I really liked because that's my mother's name. But Noemi is kind of like a socialite, and she's fairly young. She's, I would say, in her like early 20s. So one day Noemi gets a letter from her cousin, and in this letter her cousin is basically telling her that she is not enjoying her married life. She is so the letter that Noemi gets from her cousin is talking about how Noemi's cousin is not satisfied with married life. She feels uncomfortable with her husband. The house or the mansion that she lives in is haunted, and there's things in the walls, and some very scary stuff. So Noemi's father tells her to go visit her cousin, see what's up, and in return her father will fund her graduate school, because her father doesn't want her to go to grad school. He's only like really helping her to get through like her bachelor's. So Noemi goes to visit her cousin in this really secluded haunted mansion type setting, and this book was absolutely fantastic. So I don't usually read horror novels. I do watch a lot of horror films and like television, but I think this book might have just convinced me to actually tackle some of the horror books that I have here on my shelves. I think our author created fantastic tension throughout the entirety of the story, because until we got to that last stretch, I was like constantly worried that something was going to happen to our main character. I was just like waiting for like the shoe to drop, you know, metaphorically. It really did pay off at the end. So there are some trigger warnings that you should know before going in. There's like incest, mentions of cannibalism, sexual assault, attempted rape, like on page. There's also some mentions of suicide. There's also some violence and gore and just like creepy imagery that might make someone uncomfortable. So like the big twist that was eventually revealed towards the end, because I mentioned how this house is like maybe haunted, that there's ghosts and stuff, I did not see coming. I would have never like clocked it. So I think if you're the type of person who might rate a book lower because you like saw it coming, you might enjoy this, because I didn't see it coming. Mind you, I don't usually read horror, so I might not catch on to like hints and twists within the genre, as well as someone who's like a more experienced reader of horror. There's also a lot of strong imagery and symbolism, so if you're the type of person who likes to really like delve into like literary analysis, I think this book would be perfect for you. And along with the horror elements, there's also a backdrop of colonialism. You can definitely see the tones of that here, which is really great, because I think us in a more contemporary society, I think more people are realizing that the effects of colonialism, neocolonialism, still very much ring true to today. So I really did like that backdrop here in Mexico, which, by the way, I didn't mention, but it's important to know that the man that Noemi's cousin marries is a white Englishman, which is a whole other thing to unpack if we're doing like a literary analysis on colonialism like within this book. So something that was also talked about within this book was eugenics. That is also something that was really prevalent. So eugenics was basically this like belief or movement where in order to continue to perfect the human race, we had to get rid of qualities, weed out qualities that were deemed undesirable. And all this really did was allow for certain groups like the Nazis to create this idea of a superior race and an inferior race, and that is something that is definitely talked about here. So again, this goes back to a contemporary world where we live in. While we might not hear terms like eugenics and that kind of movement, you definitely still have like sprinkles of that like ideology and those beliefs in our current society. So if any of that kind of discussion interests you, here's a fantastic horror novel that kind of explores that. So there's also a little bit of a romance, and I usually do like to mention whether or not I enjoyed a romance, because more likely than not I don't care for the romance, because it's not either done in a fantastic way or it's not important enough for me to like spend my time talking about it and discussing it. So I do like to mention whether or not I enjoyed the romantic elements within a book, especially if it's not strictly a romance. So the romance in this book wasn't totally irrelevant for me. I thought it was better than normal. I think some people might really like the romance. I think it came from a good place and it developed better than most. That being said, I'm also kind of harsher on romance. So if you pick this book up, you might actually really enjoy the romantic elements. But I thought I'd just mention that because I do know that I'm not the only person who gets annoyed by unnecessary romance. And with that, I am done with this recent reads video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these, whether you liked them or you disliked them. I will link all my socials down below. I will also link the Goodreads pages for all the books that I mentioned. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace out.